Let's do it. Okay, we have to go a little bit quicker since we had some important voting to do. Okay, so today's learning the Matar Maseches is dedicated in the memory of Mindel Mariam Bas Kalman Ruvain from Shamash Aliyah. We have a short daf. It's both simple and complicated. So we'll just pick up again on the bottom of Daled Amud Aleph. On the bottom of Daled Amud Aleph by the two dots. And a discussion, really the whole entire focus of this Gemara is going to be, we're trying to figure who the Mishnah is attributed to. There's a comment, there's an opinion in this Mishnah which doesn't seem to line up with everyone, and so the Gemara is going to try to understand, since it doesn't seem to line up with everyone, who is the author of the Mishnah. The Mishnah, oftentimes when Yehuda Hanasi wrote the Mishnayos, he didn't always state who the Mishnah is, who's speaking. Sometimes he did, sometimes he didn't. But over here, we recognize there's something over here, and we'll get back to what that something is, that indicates it's not an opinion held by everyone, and therefore the entire discussion is going to be, so who is the author of the Mishnah? There's something over here which doesn't seem to line up with everyone, and so that's what we're going to be doing, going down some form of a rabbit hole, or a rabbi hole, trying to figure out who the rabbi is who authored this Mishnah. Okay, so the Mishnah said, the Mishnah talked about the ani. Remember, the ani basically goes ahead and puts his hand inside, he takes something from outside, from Rosh Hashanah, and puts it in the hands of the Bal Habayis, the guy inside, places it on his hands, and there is not Daled al Daled. Yesterday, by the way, I misspoke. I said Daled al Daled. I said 4 amos by 4 amos. That's actually quite large. We're talking about 4 tfachim by 4 tfachim, not very large. But the assumption is, the assumption of the which the Gemara is going to be asking right now is that you need the akira, the lifting up, and the placing down to be on a place of substance. The way the Rambam understands this is that if you place something, if I place an item on the edge of this chair over here, it's not really sturdy enough that we consider that a place down. It's going to fall. It's going to fall. So the assumption is you need to have a space of 4 by 4 or something like this or so, where a person places it on that item. Now that's a hanacha. That's really placing it down. And similarly, when you lift it up, the assumption is you're going to need to be lifting it up from a place of substance, from something sturdy, because if not, it never really was anywhere that you even consider an akira of taking it up. Right? So that's the Gemara's question. So Gemara asks like this. Amai chayiv, why is the ani chayiv when he takes something from the public domain and places it on the hands? A hand is not 4 by 4, a hand is a small thing. It's going to ultimately, we assume it's too small, it's going to ultimately fall. So Gemara asks, why is the ani chayiv? We need both the lifting up and the placing down on a space of 4 by 4. Veleka, and a person's hand, the balabais in this case, there's no 4 by 4. So Amar Rabba, says Rabba, Hamani Rabbi Kiva, right? We saw this yesterday. The author of the Mishnah, the opinion of the Mishnah is Rabbi Kiva, to Amar lo be'inan makom arba al arba, who does not need, who says you do not need a place of 4 by 4. How do you know that? That's done. We have a Mishnah later on in the Masechta that says, Hazorik Rishus Yachid Rishus Yachid Rishus Aram be'emtza. Okay, so the case is as follows. A guy is sitting in his home, and there is a public domain in front of his house. Okay, he lives in front of a highway. Okay, a real full-fledged public domain. House over here, and his friend lives across the highway. Okay, Rishus Yachid, Rishus Aram in the middle, and Rishus Yachid on the other side. Guy takes his ball, whatever it is, and he throws it across the Rishus Arabim, and it reaches his friend in the Rishus Yachid. Are you chayiv or not? There's machlokes. Rabbi Kiva mechayiv. Rabbi Kiva says you are liable in such a case. The chachamim potrim. The chachamim say you are exempt in such a case. Rabbi Kiva. So now the Gemara explains. Rabbi Kiva savar amrin. Rabbi Kiva, who said you are chayiv in that case, savar he holds amrinan kluta kimishahun chadamya. That's kluta. See, what was the term that we used? Or everyone has art? Contains. Thank you. If it's contained in the air. If it's contained in the air, in other words, it never landed. There was never anacha in Rishus Harabim, but it was contained in the airspace. It's as if it was on the ground. Okay? And therefore, he says, you're chayiv in that case, because even though it went from private domain to private domain, it never stopped in the public domain, but since it's suspended over the air, not really suspended, but since it's contained in the airspace of the public domain, it's like it rested in that space, and therefore, he says, you're chayiv. And the rabbis, the Rabbanan, the opposite opinion over there says that we do not say so. We do not say that it's like it landed on the ground, and therefore they say you're exempt. So the Gemara at this point is assuming that Rabbi Kiva is the author of our Mishnah, and he says even though it's on the Baal Habayis' hand, which is not really on the ground, but since he holds in airspace, it's like it's on the ground. Certainly if it's on someone's hand, it's like it's on the ground as well, and therefore there is a full-fledged hanacha. It's like it was placed down, even though it never went on the ground, it just went on the man's hand. Okay? The challenge about this is the fact that Rabbah, who suggested this answer in a previous discussion, wasn't so sure how to understand that Mishnah. Again, let's just review the words of the Mishnah. The Mishnah said, I'm standing in Rishus Yachid, and there's a Rishus Harabim between me. I throw it across. Rabbi Kiva says chayav. Rabbanan say pater. Now, the Mishnah itself doesn't explain what the rationale is. we're about to point out that Rabbah himself wasn't sure what the rationale of the Mishnah was. And here he seems to be confident about what the rationale of the Mishnah was. Okay, so the Gemara, we're going to see there's two ways of understanding this Mishnah. And early in another place, Rabbah is not sure about how to understand why Rabbi Kiva says chayav, why the Rabbanan say pater in this case. Let's see. So the Gemara says, Lememra, where are we? 1 second. Lememra, as if to say, the pshita leila Rabba, the bekluta kamisha uncha damya. Is it to say that it was pashut, it was obvious to Rabba that the contained is like it's placed down? Uvisoch asar pligi, and the Rabbanan and Rabbi Kiva are arguing about a case when it's within 10 tefachim. Okay, we'll see why he's saying that. Vami bayi bayila, Rabba. Rabba asked this as a question. Debai Rabba. When Rabba learned the Mishnah, he asked the following question. Again, all the Mishnah said is throwing from private domain, and public domain in the middle. Rabbi Kiva says chayav, chacham say pater. Rabba asked the following question. Lemata asar mi pligi, asar pligi. Are they arguing in a scenario where it was thrown in less than 10 tvachim? Ubaha pligi, and they're arguing about the following. Rabbi Kiva savar kluta kamishun chadamya. The Rabbi Kiva holds that contained is like it's placed down. V'Rabbanan savri lo amrin and kluta kamishun chadamya. And the Rabbanan say we do not say such a thing. Avalamala me'asara, but if it was above 10 tvachim, divrei kol pater, everyone would agree that you are exempt. Okay, that which is exempt. Right? Everyone agreed that above 10 tefachim you're exempt. Why? Because everyone would agree that we do not learn throwing from handing. What in the world does that mean? What that means is as follows: in the Mishkan, where the Mishkan is the source of all of Hilchos Shabbos, all of whatever took place in the Mishkan, and we're going to revisit this idea numerous times throughout the Masechta. But the 39 malachos are learned from the different things that the people would do in constructing the Mishkan, in reassembling the Mishkan. That's where we learn all the malachos. Whatever was done there, that's seen as a full-fledged malacha, and therefore that is asur on Shabbos. Now, when they were unpacking, right, they would travel in the desert and they would pack. What would they be traveling on? Most of the things would travel on wagons. Okay, and what they would sometimes do is they would take an item from one wagon, they would take like a beam from one wagon and pass it to a person in the next wagon. Okay, so now the wagon is a contained private domain, a car is a private domain, even if it's in the public area, private domain, and they're passing it over the Rishus Harabim, right? And they pass it to another wagon. Now, wagon is elevated, has wheels. It's definitely above 10 tefachim. Okay, so when they were taking things off of the wagons, they would not throw it because obviously they would get ruined. So it would only be passing it, right? And yet in the Mishkan, obviously that's a full-fledged malacha. So you're passing something from above 10 tefachim. Right, so a person's in one wagon above 10 tefachim, and there's another wagon above 10 tefachim, and they pass it one to the next. That is a malacha. But we're saying over here, we do not learn, but that's passing, handing things. But the Gemara over here is assuming we're not going to learn throwing from passing. In other words, one could argue that passing is no different than throwing, or throwing is no different than passing. Right? They're pretty similar. If I pass you something or throw you something, it's more or less the same thing. But the Gemara over here is saying, clearly, that no one is making that extrapolation. Because if they would, then we would say even above 10 tvachim, you'd be chayav. But Rabbah is saying no. The one way of understanding that machlokas Rabbi Kiva and the Chachamim is to say it's under 10 tefachim. They're arguing about this question of kluta. If it's contained, is it considered part of the ground? But in regards to above 10 tefachim, everyone would say you're exempt. Why? Because they do not extrapolate from passing to say it's the same thing as throwing. That's one way of learning the Mishnah. Okay, yeah. The other way, Odilma, the opposite, and I think it'll become clear when we see the contrast. Odilma lemala me'asar pligi. Perhaps they're arguing above 10 tefachim. Ubaha pligi, and this is what they're arguing about. Rabbi Kiva savar yalfinan zorek mimoshit. Rabbi Kiva says we do extrapolate, just like when the Kohanim or the Leviim rather would pass things from one wagon to another above 10 tefachim, and they would pass it. We extrapolate and we say similarly when I throw things from above 10 tefachim, then I'd also be chayav. V'Rabbanan savri lo yalfinan zorg mimoshit. And the Chachamim say we do not learn throwing from passing, and that's why in our Mishnah, the Mishnah we just quoted, they said you're exempt when you throw something from Rishus HaYachid to Rishus HaYachid with Rishus HaRam in the middle. Avalamata me'asara divrei kol chayav. But under 10 tefachim, both the Rabbanan and Rabbi Kiva would say you are chayav. My time why? Amrinan, because they both say kluta kamishon chadamya, because they both say that if it's contained, then it's like it's placed on the ground. So what's coming out of this? Basically, Rabbah, when he read this Mishnah, he wasn't sure. Do both the Chachamim and the Rabbi Kiva agree that kluta kamishoncha, that if it's contained, it's like it's on the ground, or do they disagree about that point? That's the basic point that's coming out of this. And yet over here, Rabbah is saying it's Rabbi Kiva's opinion. Right? Earlier, he was saying maybe the Rabbanan also agree. What's going on? In our case, he's saying, this is Rabbi Kiva's opinion, right? Elsewhere, he's saying it's possible the Rabbanan will also agree with that. Why in one case is he uncertain, in one case is he confident? So the Gemara gives a very simple answer. Gemara says, Holokasha basar di baye hadar ifshitale. Yeah, he did have the question, and then he clarified. He answered. The Gemara later on is going to actually prove that it is the opinion of Rabbi Akiva, who says Kluta Kamisho and Chadamya, and that's the proper way to understand the Mishnah. So basically he says, yeah, Rabbah once asked this question, but we all have questions, and then eventually we sometimes find resolutions to the questions. So yeah, elsewhere Rabbah asked the question, but over here, this is a later teaching. Later on, he eventually clarified. So yeah, bottom line is we're saying it is Rabbi Akiva. Okay, but here's where it's going to get a little complicated. A question you all should have asked. Okay, to suffer Rabbi Akiva Kluta Kamisho and Chadamya, right? But basically, he established that Rabbi Akiva is the one who holds that when it's contained, it's like it's on the ground, and the Rabbanan disagree. The Rabbanan do not agree to that point. But here's the question. Vidilma hanacha hu delobaya ha'akira baya. Okay, so now we're asking like this. We're saying maybe Rabbi Akiva says Kluta Kamisho and Chadamya is only when it comes to hanacha. There's two steps in taking something from the private domain to the public domain or public to private. One is lifting up, one is placing down, right? If you don't have both steps, it's not enough. Now, akira is, the word oker is like really to like break off, right? Something is really here, it's in the private domain, and I'm kind of really detaching it from the private domain and placing it in the public domain. The Gemara now asks, maybe Rabbi Akiva holds that it's true, you don't need akira, you don't need hanacha to be on a full-fledged place. Meaning, because in the case of throwing, maybe it's like it landed in Rosh Hashanah, but to say that it's really lifted up when it comes from something so insignificant, maybe we don't go that far, right? What now? Okay, so it's an interesting question, but it's more than a question. It's actually there's a stronger question, because if Rabbi Akiva, the Gemara over here is really asking, Rabbi Akiva must hold that it's only enough for hanacha, it's not enough for akira. How do you know that he says that? In other words, the Gemara is not just saying maybe. The Gemara actually, and the way Rashi understands is, he's saying Rabbi Akiva actually does hold that you only need that hanacha could take place without it landing, but akira certainly you would need it to come from a place 4x4. How do you see that from Rabbi Akiva's statements? Let's think this through. This is the public domain. I'm in the private domain. I'm throwing it to Shlomo, right? So if you really held that it's like it lands, and it's like it lands, and it's like it's oker, then I should be chayav how many times? Twice. Because I'm throwing it over the public domain, right? So it lands, and then it goes up. Lands goes up, lands goes up, lands goes up. And when it goes from the private domain into the public domain, boom, I'm chayav one chatas. And then when it goes from here, the edge of the public domain, into Shlomo's home, right? Then now, there's a new akira, because it's kamisha huncha. It's like it's landed, and there's new akira, and there's anacha now in your place. But Rabbi Akiva only said mechayev. He only said you're chayev once. So clearly, he only holds that it's sufficient for the lesser of two things, i.e. the hanacha. But he would not say it's enough for it to be an akira, right? So the author of Mishnah cannot be Rabbi Akiva, because our Mishnah, because Rabbi Akiva only holds it works one way for hanacha, but he does not say it works for akira as well. You all with me? Okay, the Gemara is now going to keep on going and say we need to find another rabbi. Ella Amar Rav Yosef, the first wide line, Hamani Rebbe. It's Rebbe. Okay, hey Rebbe, which statement of Rebbe? Ilema ha Rebbe, if you want to say it's the teaching of Rebbe in the following brisa, the Tanya, Zarg v'nacha gabe ziz kol shehu. So it talks about a case where a person throws something in the public domain and it lands on a protrusion. A little small thing, okay? He says, Rebbe mechayev chachamim potrim. Rebbe says you're chayev in that case, and the chachamim say you are pater. So the Gemara says, no, that's not a good proof, right? So that would seem to be our case, because they were talking about, right? We say basically it's able to land on a small thing, right? And he says you're chayev. So clearly you don't need it to land on a case thing of 4x4. Ziz is a small little protrusion, a small tiny thing, and we say an object lands on it, chayev. So the Gemara says, no, hasam could be in a lememer lekaman. There we're going to need, due to a whole host of questions, we're going to ultimately conclude kabaya, like Abaya says, Amar Abaye, hacha bi'ilana omed b'rshus hayachid, v'nofo notzlo rshus harabim. We're talking about a case where we have a tree. The tree is in the private domain, and its branches are extending into the public domain. Okay, v'zarg v'nach anofo. And a person throws, and it lands on a branch. The branch is small, the what's that thing called? Trunk. Thank you, gosh. Okay, the trunk is big. The trunk is 4x4, right? It's a normal sized tree. The trunk is 4x4. The branch is small. The Rebbe Savar, Rebbe says, Amrinan Shdei Nofo Basar Ikaro, that you see the branch connected to the stump, the trunk, even though the trunk is in the other domain, but basically you see it as one thing, and therefore you do have dalid al dalid. You do have the sufficient grounds. And the Rabbanan say, no, you do not say so, and that's why they say you're putter. But we still don't have an example, because there we are talking about a thing which is 4x4, just a question of, do you see the branch that's sticking out over the public domain as if it's attached to the 4x4 trunk that's in the other domain? Bottom line is, we're still going down this hole to try to find the author. Ella ha-Rebbe. There's another teaching of Rebbe. Titania, we have a brisa, Zark, Mershus Ram, Mershus Rabim, Vershus Yachid Be'emtza. Opposite case. You have two public domains, two highways. Okay, guy's standing on a highway, and there's a private domain in the middle, and he throws an item over the private domain, and it lands in the public domain. Okay? Rebbe Mechayev. Rebbe says you're chayev, right? V'chacham potrim. V'amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel. Then we have a later statement of Yehuda Amar Shmuel, who says Mechayev ha-Rebbe shtayim. And over here, Rebbe says you are chayiv too. This is what we're looking for, right? Who says it's a full-fledged, again, you're talking a case, public domain, private domain, public domain. Rebbe says throw it from the public domain to the next public domain, and he says you're chayiv twice. Why is he saying you're chayiv twice? Because there is both a hanacha, it lands, we consider it landed, and it's considered like an akira, like it went off the ground, even though it never landed on the ground, and that's exactly what we're looking for. We're looking for someone who says that even when you don't have 4x4 it's just a hand, it's both an akira and it could be considered a hanacha. So we seem to have found our author. So Mechayev hayrameir shtayim, he holds your chayev too. Echas mishum otzav, echas mishum achnasa. One because of going out, one because of going in. So we see that he does not need an akira or hanacha on a place of 4x4. This would seem to be the author of our Mishnah. The Gemara rejects this, ha'itmar Allah. But no, we learned another qualifying teaching on this teaching. Rav Shmuel, both Rav Shmuel and Amri Tavayu, who both said, Lo mechayev Rebbe ela b'reshus hayachid mikora. Rebbe said this halacha in a scenario where the private domain, he threw something. Imagine the scenario, the following setup. You have a highway, you have a private domain that has a roof on it, okay? And he throws it through the private domain that has the roof in it. There, since it has a roof, damrinan basic command malya damya. Since the private domain has a roof on it, we treat it as if it's full. And if it's full, a full space, then it's as if the item landed somewhere in a full space. In other words, the roof makes it as if we treat the whole thing. It's not a private, meaning there's a private domain like your fenced-in backyard. That's a private domain. But there it has nothing on top of it. When you have something on top of it, conceptually you could see it's as if the whole thing is filled up. And therefore, when a person throws from public domain through the private domain and it's full, it's as if it landed somewhere, as if it came off from somewhere. So Rebbe's halacha, that case where he said you're chayiv twice, is specifically in a roofed private domain. Okay? So there, we say the whole house is filled. If it doesn't have a roof, then we don't say that. And maybe you want to tell us that in our Mishnah also. So we say, wait, we could still say our Mishnah is Rebbe, and say that our case is a case where there are roofs over the domains. So you could say that in the private domain that it has a roof in it. Sure, no problem. That when the Baal Habayis has his hand out, there's a roof on it, and therefore, even though it didn't land on a daled by daled place, but since it has a roof, we treat the whole place as if it's full. And Rebbe would say, therefore, it landed on a full-fledged place in your chayav. However, Shus Rabba Mikora Michayav. But let's say you have a public domain that has a roof on it. Come up with a scenario, it has whatever, roof over a public domain, you wouldn't be chayiv in such a case. The Amar of Shmuel bar Yehuda Amar Rebbe Abba Amar Rav Huna Amar Rav Hamaver Chayfetz Sal Amos B'Shus Ram Mikora. If a person is in a public domain, imagine you had a highway that has a roof on it, okay, has a bridge. It's a bridge. Let's say it's a public domain, has a roof on it. You would not be chayiv. Why not? Lefi she'ena doma ledigle midbar, because it is not similar to the people traveling in the desert. The whole source for the halacha of carrying is when you are doing so, which in a public domain has to be similar to that of the Jewish people traveling in the desert. They did not have a roof over their head, they had clouds. They don't have a roof over their head, and therefore there's no way of creating our scenario with a roof. The bottom line is the Gemara is still not conclusive, trying to find out who the author of our Mishnah is. It's not Rabbi Kiva, it's not Rebbe, and now the Gemara is going to give some other suggestions in terms of who it is. As much as like this seems like again another long discussion which doesn't seem to be too substantive. There's a very important Gemara in Megillah which talks about the fact that Esther, when she goes ahead and Esther goes ahead and tells Achashverosh that his life is in danger, that people are plotting to kill him, but she doesn't just say, "I know this." What does she say? She says, "Mordechai told me me this is going to happen, right? And only because she said, Mordechai told me this is going to happen, he writes it down in his book, and it ultimately is the salvation for the entire story. And the Gemara basically concludes that a person, it's critical to say things b'shem omro. It's critical to know who the author of a statement is. We don't just say things, specifically, and the Gemara understands, and many of the Mepharshim understand, specifically when it comes to Divrei Torah, it's critical that we say them b'shem omro, that we know where it's sourced. The idea is that Torah, we don't just make up Torah. Torah goes all the way back to Har Sinai. It's critical that we know the Masorah, that we know the tradition, and that's why, we're going to spend a blot of Gemara, a daf of Gemara, trying to figure out who the author is, because it's critical to really recognize it's not a bunch of people just shooting from the hip, but rather we're going all the way back to Har Sinai. We need to know who the author is of each statement, and as the Gemara says, by doing so, maybe brings Geula, just like Mordechai brought the redemption in doing so. Similarly, the more we're able to connect ourselves to Har Sinai of the past, we're able to connect ourselves with Har Sinai of the future. Have a great day.